Sometimes the hardest moments in life come not with a bang, but with a quiet knock on your childhood bedroom door at 2 in the morning. That's how it started for me, watching my daughter Emma transform from the bright-eyed girl who used to dance in our kitchen to someone I could barely recognize. This is a story about love, loss, and the terrifying moment when you realize that sometimes loving someone means letting them walk away, even when every fiber of your being wants to pull them close and never let go. Emma was 21 when she first told me she didn't feel like she fit into the world the way everyone expected her to. We were sitting in our favorite coffee shop in Denver, the one with the mismatched chairs, and the barista who always remembered our orders. She stirred her lavender latte nervously, avoiding my eyes, as she explained that some days she felt like neither a girl nor a boy, but something in between, something fluid and undefined. I remember the way the afternoon sun caught the dust motes floating between us, how time seemed to slow down as I processed what she was telling me. Looking back now, I can see that was the moment everything began to shift, like tectonic plates moving beneath the surface of our relationship. At the time, I thought I was being supportive. I nodded, I listened, I told her I loved her no matter what, but maybe I didn't truly hear what she was trying to tell me. Maybe I was too focused on my own confusion, my own need to understand everything in neat categories, to really see the pain she was carrying. 2 years passed in what felt like a heartbeat and a lifetime all at once. Emma had moved back home after college, and we fell into a comfortable routine of morning coffees and evening walks around our neighborhood. She seemed happier, more settled, working at a local bookstore, and talking about maybe going back to school for her master's degree. I thought we had found our rhythm again, that mother-daughter dance we'd been perfecting since she was small. Then came that February evening when everything shattered. I was making dinner, humming along to an old song on the radio when Emma walked into the kitchen with a look on her face I'll never forget. It was fear mixed with defiance, like a cornered animal ready to fight or flee. She stood there for a moment, gripping the doorframe, before the words tumbled out in a rush. She was 4 months pregnant. The wooden spoon slipped from my hand, clattering against the tile floor, spaghetti sauce splattering like abstract art across the white cabinets. What followed was a conversation that still haunts me in the quiet hours before dawn. Emma's voice rose to a pitch I'd never heard before as she blamed me for not understanding her, for not helping her get hormone blockers when she was younger, for not seeing who she really was. She said it was my fault she was pregnant because I had forced her to be someone she wasn't. The logic didn't make sense to me then, and it still doesn't now, but the pain in her voice was real enough to cut through any attempt at reason. But what she said next left me speechless. She looked at me with those eyes that had once gazed up at me with such trust and said she didn't want to be a mother. She wanted me to raise the baby as my own, as if it were Emma's sibling rather than her child. It was my duty, she said, because my failure to accept her non-binary identity had led to this moment. The absurdity of it all would have been laughable if it weren't so heartbreaking. I felt something harden inside me then, a protective shell forming around my heart. I heard my own voice, steady and firm despite the chaos swirling inside me, saying words I never thought I'd have to say to my child. "Congratulations, Mummy," I told her. "You have some hard decisions to make." I made it clear that while I would support her through this, I would absolutely not raise her baby for her. The role of mother was hers to accept or reject, but it wasn't mine to assume. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's face crumpled like paper in flame, and without another word, she turned and ran up the stairs. The slam of her bedroom door echoed through the house like a gunshot. I stood there in the kitchen, sauce still dripping from the cabinets, listening to the muffled sounds of her crying through the ceiling. 12 hours she stayed locked in that room, and I knew she had a stash of snacks in there because she'd always been one to prepare for emotional sieges. The middle of that long night brought its own drama. I woke to the sound of drawers opening and closing, the zip of a suitcase being packed. By the time I made it to the hallway, Emma was already at the front door with a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't look at me as she informed me in a voice devoid of emotion that she had already called the police to let them know she was leaving of her own free will and wasn't in any danger, as if I would report my 23-year-old daughter as a runaway. The insult of it stung worse than the leaving itself. I told her the door would always be open when she was ready to come home with a plan for her future and her baby's future. She left without a word, the door clicking shut with a finality that felt like an ending to a story I wasn't ready to close. The house felt impossibly empty after that, every room echoing with memories of the daughter I thought I knew. 3 days later, I received a text asking me to meet them at an IHOP downtown. Them. Plural. My heart knew before my mind accepted it who would be sitting across from me in that vinyl booth. And I was right. There was Emma, looking smaller somehow, dwarfed by the presence of River, the one friend from her high school group I had always felt uneasy about. River had been part of Emma's circle since they were all 16, but there had always been something about them that set off my maternal alarm bells. I remembered an incident from when they were 18, when the friend group was watching movies in our living room. Every time I walked past, River would catch my eye and make inappropriate gestures, testing boundaries with the boldness of youth. When I finally confronted them in the kitchen after they'd followed me and made crude miming motions behind my back, I had to forcibly remove them from our house. Now here they sat hand in hand with my daughter, transformed in appearance but still radiating that same unsettling energy. The IHOP meeting was a disaster from the first moment. River did most of the talking while Emma sat silent, occasionally nodding along like a puppet on strings. According to River, I was poisoning my daughter by supporting her decision to take birth control. I was a monster for not providing hormone blockers years ago. It would take years of therapy to undo the damage I had caused. And most egregiously, I was failing Emma by not agreeing to raise their child while they worked on healing themselves. The absurdity of it all might have been funny if it weren't so tragic. Here was River, pounding their fist on the table, hard enough to make the syrup bottles jump, declaring themselves homeless and unable to care for a child while simultaneously painting me as the villain for not volunteering to take on their responsibility. The other diners tried not to stare, but I could feel their eyes on us, this small drama playing out between the pancakes and coffee refills. I asked the obvious question about why River couldn't take responsibility for the child they had helped create. The answer was that River's parents were even worse than me, apparently, and they were currently without stable housing. Yet somehow, in their twisted logic, this made me the bad guy for not immediately volunteering to raise their baby while they figured out their lives. I left that IHOP with a heavy heart but a clear conscience. I had made my position known. I would not enable their fantasy by taking on their parental responsibilities. If they chose to give the baby up for adoption, that was their choice. If they chose to raise it themselves, I would support them in whatever way I could. But I would not pretend that their child was my responsibility to raise. The text I sent Emma later that day was simple. I told her I loved her, that I would always be there for her, but that River was not welcome in our home. The response was swift and predictable. I was blocked on everything, cut off from even the digital crumbs of her life. My house felt like a mausoleum after that, every photo on the wall a reminder of the daughter who had chosen a different path. In desperation, I reached out to River's parents, hoping maybe they had some insight or could help. The conversation was brief and illuminating. They had essentially disowned River after years of destructive behavior and manipulation. They wished me luck, but made it clear they wanted no part of whatever drama was unfolding. I couldn't blame them, really. Sometimes love means knowing when to step back. Weeks passed in a blur of worry and sleepless nights. I found myself jumping every time my phone buzzed, hoping for word from Emma. I drove past the bookstore where she used to work, past the coffee shop where we'd had our talks, past all the landmarks of our life together. It was like grieving someone who was still alive, a particular kind of pain that has no name. Then, on a Thursday afternoon that had started like any other, I came home from grocery shopping to find someone sitting on my front porch. For a moment, my heart leapt, thinking Emma had come home. But as I got closer, I realized this person was a stranger to me, though they wore Emma's face. The changes were shocking. Her once glossy hair was matted and dull. Her face bore several small tattoos that looked like they had been done in someone's garage. She had aged a decade in the weeks she'd been gone, her skin sallow and her eyes darting nervously like a wild animal. The smell hit me before I even reached the porch, a combination of unwashed clothes and something else, something that made my maternal instincts scream in alarm. She chattered at me non-stop, words tumbling over each other in a stream of consciousness that made little sense. She was angry that I'd changed the locks, though she seemed to expect to waltz back into her childhood room as if nothing had happened. Against every warnings bell in my head, I let her in. She was still my daughter, still the baby I'd held in my arms 23 years ago, even if I could barely recognize her now. I insisted she shower first, and while she was in the bathroom, I sat on her old bed and wept for the girl she used to be. The shower ran for nearly an hour, and I wondered if she was trying to wash away more than just the physical dirt of wherever she'd been living. When she emerged, wearing her old pajamas that now hung loose on her frame, the talking resumed immediately. She spoke about River and their grand plans, about building a new society of evolved humans, about transcending the binary constraints of the old world. She mentioned other partners River had, seemingly unbothered by this arrangement, speaking of wheels and spokes and connections that transcended physical reality. Not once in her rambling did she mention the baby growing inside her. I tried to interject, to bring the conversation back to practical matters like prenatal care and plans for after the birth. But it was like trying to redirect a river with my bare hands. She would nod absently at my questions, then launch back into her theories about empathic connections and dimensional consciousness. She claimed she'd been seeing a doctor regularly, but something in the way her eyes shifted when she said it told me this was another lie in a growing web of deception. As the days passed with Emma back under my roof, the situation grew increasingly surreal. She treated our home like a hotel, leaving messes everywhere, eating everything in sight, but never cleaning up after herself. She seemed to have lost all sense of basic hygiene and courtesy. The toilet would go unflushed, dishes would pile up in her room, and she would demand I take her out to restaurants as if I were her personal chauffeur and ATM. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, taking her shopping for baby supplies, hoping that seeing the tiny clothes and necessities might spark some maternal feeling in her. But she wandered through the store like a ghost, picking up items at random with no thought to their purpose or necessity. When I tried to ask about her plans for after the birth, she would launch into another speech about cosmic destiny and the new world order they were building in their camp. The due date she had originally given me came and went, adding another layer of anxiety to an already impossible situation. I had been tracking it obsessively on my calendar, but when I questioned her about it, she waved me off with vague mentions of miscalculations and fluid timelines. Everything in her world seemed to exist in this nebulous space where facts were malleable and reality was subjective. Then came the night that will forever be etched in my memory with the clarity of broken glass. I woke to the sound of Emma moaning in pain, and I found her doubled over in the hallway, her water about to break. The ride to the hospital was a blur of contractions and Emma alternating between begging for help and cursing my existence. I white-knuckled the steering wheel, trying to offer comfort while navigating through the empty streets of our sleeping city. At the hospital, the truth finally came crashing down. Emma had not been to a single prenatal appointment. She was flagged as high risk immediately, and the nurses and doctors surrounded her with a level of urgent care that made my blood run cold. How had I let it get this far? How had I failed to see through her lies? The guilt threatened to swallow me whole as I watched the medical team work to ensure both mother and baby would survive this neglect. What happened in that delivery room broke my heart in ways I didn't know were possible. As the contractions intensified and the medical staff tried to help her through the process, Emma transformed into someone I had never seen before. She spewed hatred at the nurses who were trying to save her life and her baby's life. She called them names I won't repeat, accused them of persecution, declared herself their queen, and demanded they bow before her. The vitriol that poured from her lips was so intense, so unlike anything I'd ever heard from her before, that I had to step outside the room several times just to catch my breath. The nursing staff, to their eternal credit, maintained their professionalism in the face of her abuse. They spoke to her calmly, administered pain relief when she would allow it, and continued their life-saving work even as she raged against them. I pulled one nurse aside during a brief calm moment and explained about the camp, about River, about my suspicions that drugs or mental illness or both were at play here. The nurse patted my shoulder with a kindness that nearly undid me, saying they would make sure the appropriate people were informed. To my complete shock, when the blood work came back, it showed no signs of drugs in Emma's system. This revelation hit me harder than if they'd found every substance known to man. If this behavior wasn't chemically induced, then what had happened to my daughter? How had she gone from the thoughtful, if confused young woman I'd known to this creature filled with rage and delusion? The social worker who came to speak with me was patient and understanding, but she couldn't offer any definitive answers about Emma's mental state. She took notes as I explained about the camp, about River, about the gradual transformation I'd witnessed. She asked gentle questions about Emma's history, any previous signs of mental illness, any trauma that might have triggered this break from reality. I had no answers that made sense. This felt like a possession, like something had inhabited my daughter's body and driven out the soul I knew. Against all odds, the baby was born healthy. A perfect little girl with 10 fingers and 10 toes and a lusty cry that should have melted any mother's heart. But Emma refused to even look at her. The nurses brought the baby to her, trying to encourage that first vital bond between mother and child. But Emma turned her face to the wall and pretended they weren't there. She had carried this life for 9 months, gone through the pain of bringing her into the world, and now acted as if the baby was nothing more than a stranger's burden. I held my granddaughter for the first time while Emma slept, and I felt my heart shatter and rebuild itself in the space of a single breath. This innocent life, perfect and unmarred by the chaos that had brought her here, deserved so much more than what was unfolding around her. I whispered promises to her that I couldn't keep, apologies for a world that had already failed her, and prayers to any deity that might be listening to protect her from the storm she'd been born into. That evening, while I was in the cafeteria grabbing a coffee that I desperately needed to stay upright, Emma disappeared. She simply walked out of the hospital without formally discharging herself, without saying goodbye to me or acknowledging the baby she'd left behind. The nurses found her bed empty, her few belongings gone, and no trace of where she'd headed. Because the hospital was a safe surrender site, there would be no charges for abandonment. But that legal technicality did nothing to ease the ache in my chest. I knew where she had gone, of course. Back to River, back to the camp, back to the fantasy world where she could pretend that none of this had happened. The social worker explained the next steps, how the baby would be placed in foster care, pending adoption proceedings, how there were good families waiting for infants, how she would have a chance at a normal life. I nodded and signed papers and tried not to think about how I was signing away my own grandchild, this piece of my daughter that might be all I had left of her. The house felt different when I returned home alone, emptier than empty, if such a thing were possible. I found myself standing in Emma's room, looking at the mess she'd left behind, the discarded clothes and half-eaten food, the remnants of her brief return. I couldn't bring myself to clean it up right away. It felt too final, too much like admitting she was really gone. Days blurred into weeks, and I tried to rebuild some semblance of a life. I went back to work, went through the motions of normalcy, but everything felt off-kilter. I found myself checking my phone constantly, hoping for a message that never came. I drove past places I thought she might be, looking for any sign of her or the camp she'd described, but it was like they had vanished into the ether, leaving no trace except the destruction in their wake. The hardest part was the not knowing. Was she safe? Was she eating? Was she warm enough at night? The weather turned cold and I lay awake, thinking about her sleeping outside, wondering if maternal love could somehow transcend distance and keep her warm. I reached out to homeless services, gave them her description, begged them to let me know if they saw her. But privacy laws and the fact that she was an adult meant they could tell me nothing, even if they knew something. 3 months after the birth, I made a decision that I'd been wrestling with since that night at the hospital. I contacted the social worker to ask about the baby, my granddaughter who I'd held for such a brief moment. She couldn't tell me much, privacy laws again, but she did say that the baby had been placed with a loving foster family who hoped to adopt her. She was thriving, meeting all her milestones, a happy and healthy little girl who would never know the chaos of her origins. It should have comforted me, but it only added another layer to my grief. I started attending a support group for parents of adult children with mental illness. Sitting in that circle of folding chairs, holding my styrofoam cup of weak coffee, I found a strange comfort in discovering I wasn't alone. Other mothers and fathers shared stories that echoed mine in heartbreaking ways. Children who had been brilliant and loving transformed by illness or addiction or both into strangers who bore only a physical resemblance to the people they'd raised. We shared resources, coping strategies, and most importantly, the understanding that could only come from those walking the same devastating path. Through the group, I learned about boundaries, about enabling versus helping, about the impossible balance between keeping hope alive and protecting your own sanity. I learned that love doesn't always mean holding on. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let go and pray they find their way back. But knowing something intellectually and accepting it emotionally are two very different things. And I struggled with the gap between them every single day. 6 months after Emma left the hospital, I made another difficult decision. The house held too many memories, too many ghosts of the life we'd shared. Every room was a reminder of what had been lost, every photo on the wall a dagger to the heart. I put it on the market and found a smaller place across town, somewhere Emma wouldn't know to find if she came looking. It felt like a betrayal and a necessity all at once. The day I moved, I left a letter with the neighbours just in case. In it, I told Emma I loved her, that I always would, and included my new contact information. I told her that when she was ready to get help, real help, I would be there. But I also made it clear that River was not welcome in my life, that I would not enable the delusions that had taken her from me. It was the hardest letter I've ever written, each word feeling like another brick in the wall between us. Life in the new place was quieter, but no less painful. I threw myself into work, into volunteering, into anything that would fill the hours and keep my mind occupied. But grief has a way of finding you in the quiet moments, in the space between heartbeats, in the silence of an empty house. I would catch myself setting out 2 coffee cups in the morning, or buying Emma's favourite cereal at the grocery store. Small habits that died hard. The holidays were the worst. That first Christmas without her, I couldn't bring myself to put up a tree. What was the point of decorating for ghosts and memories? Instead, I volunteered at a shelter, serving meals to the homeless, scanning every face for features I might recognise. Every young woman with Emma's build made my heart skip, but it was never her. The other volunteers probably thought I was incredibly dedicated, not knowing I was just desperately searching for my lost daughter in a sea of lost souls. A year passed, then another. The acute pain dulled into a chronic ache, always there but manageable most days. I learned to speak about Emma in the past tense, without crying. Learned to answer questions about children with vague responses that didn't invite further inquiry. I built a new life, smaller and quieter than the one I'd imagined, but sustainable in its simplicity. Then, on a random Tuesday that had started like any other, I saw her. I was pumping gas at a station on the outskirts of town when a group of people emerged from a van at the next pump. They moved with the synchronized purposelessness of those living on the margins, and something about one figure caught my eye. Thinner, hair a different colour, but the way she moved, the tilt of her head, it was unmistakably Emma. I froze, my hand still on the gas pump, watching as she laughed at something one of her companions said. She looked healthier than when I'd last seen her, but there was still something wild in her eyes, something untethered from the reality the rest of us inhabited. I wanted to call out to her to run across the concrete and pull her into my arms, but I remained frozen, afraid that any movement might spook her like a deer in the woods. As if sensing my gaze, she turned and our eyes met across the distance. For a moment, neither of us moved. I saw recognition flash in her eyes, followed quickly by something else. Fear, shame, defiance? Before I could decipher it, she turned away, said something to her group, and they all piled back into the van. I stood there watching as they drove away, my daughter disappearing into the distance once again, leaving me with nothing but the smell of gasoline and the weight of unspoken words. That night, I cried harder than I had in months, not just for the daughter I'd lost, but for the daughter she'd chosen to remain. She had looked fed, clothed, not obviously ill or in distress. Whatever life she'd built in River's world, whatever reality she inhabited, she had chosen it over the one I could offer. And that, perhaps, was the hardest truth to swallow. It wasn't that she couldn't come home. It was that she wouldn't. I thought about my granddaughter that night too, hoping she was being read bedtime stories by adoptive parents who loved her, hoping she would grow up unburdened by the chaos that had marked her entry into the world. I imagined her taking her first steps, saying her first words, starting school, all the milestones I would never witness. But maybe that was a mercy. Maybe she deserved a life untouched by this generational pain. The support group became even more vital after that sighting. I shared what had happened, how seeing her had reopened wounds I thought had started to heal. The group listened with the patience of those who understood that grief isn't linear. That healing isn't a destination but a journey with no clear endpoint. They reminded me that Emma was an adult, making adult choices, however much I might disagree with them, and that I couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. I threw myself back into building my new life with renewed determination. I took up pottery, finding something therapeutic in shaping clay with my hands, creating something beautiful from raw earth. I adopted a rescue dog, a gentle soul who seemed to understand that we were both healing from past wounds. I even started dating again, tentatively, finding companionship with a widower from my book club who understood that some losses never fully heal. But through it all, I kept that space in my heart for Emma. Not a shrine to who she used to be, but a quiet hope for who she might still become. Recovery isn't linear, the group reminded me constantly. People can spend years in the wilderness of mental illness or addiction before finding their way back. The door to redemption is never fully closed as long as there's breath in their bodies. I updated my letter with the neighbours every 6 months, making sure my contact information was current, that the olive branch remained extended. I kept myself findable online, maintaining social media profiles I rarely used just in case she went looking. I walked the line between hope and self-protection, keeping my heart open enough for love, but guarded enough to survive another disappointment. Sometimes I wondered about River, about the hold they seemed to have over Emma and the others in their orbit. Were they a true believer in their own delusions, or a manipulator taking advantage of vulnerable people? It didn't really matter, I supposed. The result was the same. They had offered Emma something I couldn't or wouldn't, a complete escape from reality. A world where consequences didn't exist and responsibility could be shed like an old coat. The hardest moments came at unexpected times. A young woman at the coffee shop with Emma's laugh. A mother and daughter shopping together at Target, debating throw pillow colours with the easy intimacy I'd once taken for granted. The smell of lavender, which had been her favourite scent. These small ambushes of memory could knock the wind out of me, leaving me gripping a shopping cart or a coffee cup while the world spun on, oblivious to my private devastation. But there were good moments too. Slowly, carefully, I began to build relationships with other young people in my life. A colleague's daughter who needed career advice. A neighbour's teenager who loved my dog and started walking him after school. I found ways to channel the maternal love that had nowhere to go, spreading it in smaller doses to those who could receive it. It wasn't the same, would never be the same, but it was something. 3 years after that gas station sighting, I received a call that stopped my heart. Unknown number, local area code. I answered with shaking hands to hear a voice I barely recognised as Emma's. She was in the hospital, she said. Not hurt, just tired. So tired. River was gone, had been gone for months, moved on to new hunting grounds with fresh victims. The camp had dissolved, people scattering like seeds in the wind. She had tried to keep going, to maintain the fantasy alone, but without River's constant reinforcement, reality had started seeping in through the cracks. I drove to the hospital in a daze, equal parts terrified and hopeful. The woman I found in that bed was a shadow of my daughter, thin to the point of emaciation, aged far beyond her 26 years, with eyes that had seen too much and believed too many lies. But she was alive, and she was asking for help, and that was more than I had dared hope for in so long. The road back has been neither straight nor easy. Psychiatric treatment, therapy, slow rebuilding of trust and connection. Emma has been diagnosed with several mental health conditions that likely predated River but were exploited and exacerbated by that toxic relationship. She struggles with the guilt of abandoning her daughter, with the lost years, with the person she became under River's influence. Some days are better than others. Some days we can almost pretend to be a normal mother and daughter, drinking coffee and talking about movies. Other days, she retreats into herself, and I can see her fighting against the pull of the alternate reality that once consumed her. She asked about the baby once, 6 months into her recovery. I told her the truth, that her daughter had been adopted, that she was loved and cared for, that she had a chance at a good life. Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face, and we never spoke of it again. Some wounds are too deep for words, some losses too profound for redemption. We focus instead on what can be salvaged, on building something new from the wreckage of what was. I've learned so much through this journey. I've learned that mental illness can strike anyone, that manipulation can happen to the smartest and strongest among us, that love isn't always enough to save someone. I've learned that boundaries aren't walls but bridges, that enabling isn't helping, that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same thing. I've learned that hope can coexist with heartbreak, that you can grieve someone who's still alive, that forgiveness is a process, not a destination. Most importantly, I've learned that there are some stories that don't have clean endings, that life isn't a movie where everything resolves in the third act. Emma is back in my life, but she's not the daughter I raised, and I'm not the mother I was. We're two survivors of the same shipwreck, clinging to whatever debris we can find, slowly making our way toward a shore we can't quite see yet. It's not the life either of us planned, but it's the life we have, and we're learning to be grateful for it. I still think about my granddaughter sometimes, especially when I see little girls her age at the park or the grocery store. I wonder if she has Emma's eyes or her stubborn chin. I wonder if she's musical like Emma was, if she loves to dance, if she asks endless questions about how the world works. I hope she does all of these things with parents who can give her the stability Emma couldn't. I hope she grows up feeling loved and secure and never has to question her place in the world. The support group continues to be a lifeline, though my role has shifted somewhat. Now I'm often the one offering hope to new members, the living proof that sometimes they do come back, that sometimes the story continues even when you thought it had ended. I share our journey with careful honesty, not sugarcoating the difficulties, but not extinguishing hope either. Every story is different, every path to recovery unique, but the pain of loving someone through mental illness creates a bond that transcends individual circumstances. Emma lives in a supervised housing situation now, halfway between independence and support. She's learning to manage her conditions with medication and therapy, to recognize the warning signs of sliding back into delusion, to build a life based in reality, even when reality feels unbearably hard. We see each other twice a week, sometimes more if she's having a good stretch. We're relearning how to be in each other's lives without trying to save or fix each other. River resurfaced briefly about a year ago, trying to reconnect with Emma through social media. The message threw her into a tailspin that lasted weeks, but she worked through it with her therapist and ultimately blocked them without responding. It was a victory, small but significant, proof that she was no longer the person who could be so easily influenced. We celebrated quietly that night with takeout Chinese food and a movie, not talking about what had happened, but both understanding its importance. I've made peace with the life I have now, mostly. There are still moments of profound sadness, still times when I mourn the future I thought we'd have, the grandchildren I'd know, the simple pleasures of an uncomplicated mother-daughter relationship. But there's beauty in this harder truth too, in the fierce love that survives even the worst storms, in the small victories that mean more because of how hard won they are, in the grace of second chances, even when they look nothing like what we'd hoped. This story doesn't have a neat conclusion because life doesn't offer neat conclusions. Emma continues to heal and struggle and heal again. I continue to love her while maintaining boundaries that keep us both safe. We move forward together and separately, tethered by blood and history, but no longer drowning each other in our respective pain. It's not the story I would have written for us, but it's the story we're living. And there's a strange beauty in that truth. To anyone reading this who sees their own child in Emma, who recognizes their own pain in mine, I want you to know you're not alone. The path is hard and lonely, and there are no guarantees, but there is always hope. Not the naive hope that everything will go back to how it was, but the harder hope that something new can be built from the ruins. That love can evolve and endure even when it's tested beyond what seems bearable. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply continue to witness, to remain findable, to keep the light on, even when you're not sure anyone's looking for it. The morning sun is streaming through my kitchen window as I finish writing this, and somewhere across town, Emma is probably waking up too. Maybe today will be a good day. Maybe it won't. But it will be a day we both show up for, imperfectly but persistently, writing the next chapter of a story that refused to end when we thought it had. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's everything.